Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the State of LGBT Rights in the Americas webinar. My name is Guy Mentel, and I am the Executive Director of Global Americans. We are thrilled to be hosting this timely webinar and to be celebrating Pride with you all today. If this is your first time joining us for a Global Americans webinar, or if this is your first introduction to our organization generally, we encourage you to visit our website, theglobalamericans.org, and to subscribe to our weekly newsletter for critical analysis on the region that seeks to broaden the discussion of the Americas within the global context. We also invite you to check out our podcast, which is a joint venture with the Canadian Council of the Americas called Two Gringos with Questions, which is co-hosted by Chris Sabatini and Ken Frankel of the Canadian Council. Recent interviewees include Francis Fukuyama, Tim Reeser of the United States Senate, former New Zealand Prime Minister Helen Clark, President of Univision, Daniel Coronel, anthropologist Wade Davis, and many, many more. That podcast is available and accessible on SoundCloud, Spotify, iTunes, and of course our website, which is again, theglobalamericans.org. So for today's event, we invite you to write questions in the Q&A box that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. Just a note that we may or may not get to all of them due to time, but we do invite you to contact us that way, and we will be actively monitoring those questions as they come in. And so without further ado, I'm delighted to be joined by some of the leading figures of the LGBT rights movement in the Americas. First, we have Hunter Carter, who is a partner at the law firm Arent and a founding board member of Global Americans. Hunter served as co-counsel for Chilean LGBT advocacy group Movimiento para la Liberación Homosexual in denouncing the Chilean government for denying 3 same-sex couples civil marriages. He's also been a critical player in forming the Alliance for Marriage in the Americas, which is an informal group of pro bono lawyers supporting cases in Mexico, Panama, and Colombia, among others. Next, we have Iván Chanis, who is the president and founder of Fundación Iguales in Panama, a nonprofit organization that is dedicated to the promotion, respect, and observance of human rights. Iván previously served as political and legal counsel of the Permanent Mission of Panama to the OAS here in Washington, D.C., among other diplomatic posts throughout his distinguished career. Next, we have Margarita Salas, who is the co-founder and president of the Vamos Party in Costa Rica, where she has had a long and illustrious career as an LGBT rights defender. We are particularly excited to have Margarita joining us today as we celebrate her recent appointment as Presidential Commissioner for LGBT issues in Costa Rica. Next, we have Javier Corrales, who is a professor and chair of political science at Amherst College and one of the youngest scholars ever to be selected as a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars here in Washington, D.C. Javier is currently engaged in a number of research projects, including, and most relevant to today's discussion, a study of the factors helping to expand LGBT rights in Latin America. Last, but certainly not least, we are privileged to have Gabriela Zavaleta joining us. Gabriela is president of Más Igualdad Perú and is one of the leading LGBT rights activists in Peru who rose to prominence in the Unión Civil Ya campaign in Peru. We are thrilled and honored to have you all here with us as we celebrate Pride, and we look forward to an engaging conversation about the state of LGBT rights in the Americas. So I'd like to start by directing a question to the entire panel, but I'll start with Hunter, and then I'll swing it around the table, so to speak. So we are today, almost to the day, at the 5-year anniversary of the Obergefell v. Hodges decision here in the United States. We're also roughly 3 years removed from when the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights determined that marriage equality was a human right. As we all know, and as we've seen across the hemisphere, progress often comes in small increments. Sometimes 2 steps forward is followed by 1 step back, and sometimes movements towards justice and equality face dark days of pushback and obstruction. But ultimately, all of this work, all of this movement is propelled forward by the persistent efforts of dedicated human rights defenders such as yourselves, even on days, and in my view, particularly on days when justice doesn't arrive in the form of a Supreme Court decision or a Human Rights Commission opinion. So Hunter, in reflecting on Obergefell and on the IACHR's opinion a few years ago, what obstacles have you encountered in your work since? And in the grand scheme of things, in your view, where along the path of progress do we find ourselves today? In other words, what is, in your mind, the state of the LGBT rights movement today?
I'll try to do that in 10 words or less. Good morning and happy Pride, everybody. It's really exciting to be on this panel, and I thank you, Guy and Global Americans, for making this opportunity available to our listeners and viewers, and particularly for having such a diverse panel in every sense of that word. I also can't start without acknowledging that your question is asked in the context of the explosion in our country of attention to the nagging problem of racial injustice, and the fact that we just are not solving the problem and it continues to boil over. It sets a context. The fact that so many people are out there affirming Black Lives Matter, and that our workplaces, my workplace, our clients' workplaces, are really struggling to deal with structural and inherited racism, is both a sign of progress, as you say, and a sign of the fact that we need to progress. And so I think that sets a lens through which I see the progress we've made in the Americas. In 2012, after we got marriage equality in New York, and I worked on that for the New York State Bar Association, we saw the New York State Bar Association, later the New York State Legislature, reverse position. They went from no to yes. And then I was hired to go down to Chile as a pro bono lawyer and work with the team there to bring a claim before the Inter-American Commission. And over time, with a new president, we negotiated a friendly settlement agreement. And I would have said that we were making progress. We went from polls showing 24% support for marriage equality in the spring of 2012 to polls showing north of 60% of Chileans supporting marriage equality in 2015, 2016, 2017. It continued to rise. We struck a deal with the Chilean government. It was hard fought, by the way, even with President Bachelet, to put specific language in there requiring the government to promote marriage equality legislation as one of 7 or 8 elements of our settlement agreement. And I'm here today to tell you that in the last few days, we have terminated that settlement agreement. We have notified the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights that we feel no longer bound by it because the government is not adhering to it. The government's ministers announced before the public unrest in the fall that rather than promote marriage equality legislation, they would do their best to impede it. Instead of impulsar, impedir. A clearer example of state resistance to implementing human rights is hard to find. This is not only in the face of an agreement, but of course, as Margarita and others know on this call very well, it was in the face of the OC24, the consultative opinion of the Inter-American Court. Today, in the last 2 weeks, we saw further erosion of the promise of human rights for the gay and lesbian community in Chile, because the Constitutional Tribunal repeated the sin that we denounced back in 2012. They handed down a decision that on its face is borderline ridiculous. It reads like the least well-educated anti-marriage activist wrote it. It compared same-sex marriage with plural marriage and abuse of children. It really was one of the most exhausting exercises in not citing to the controlling law and citing cases that are out of date or from other systems that don't follow the law that applies to Chile. I stress these points because if you were to look at Chile, I think you'd see a microcosm of the broader hemisphere. Lots of progress. We made progress on the other elements of our settlement agreement, for example. Lots of progress in the social debate. We launched marriage equality as a public discussion because when you debate marriage equality, you debate whether the state can impose a stigma. And in this most recent decision, what the government, what the Constitutional Tribunal said was basically, you have a civil union law. And so the 2 women from Spain who were married in Spain, who have a child, who applied for the civil status of marriage in Chile, were told, that's good enough. It's different, but you're different. And that's exactly the stigma. The Massachusetts Supreme Court saw that back in the 2008 timeframe, when the legislature there tried to say, we'll give you the same rights, but we won't call it marriage. Well, nobody understands what that is. When you go to a hospital or a neighboring state, the value of that marriage is less. It's second-class citizens. And that's what we just saw again in Chile. Oddly, that was on a Friday. On the following Monday, a family court recognized the parental rights of 2 lesbian parents of a child. So my report is that we are in a state of great progress, of great debate, but we have very far to go. The 2 steps forward, 1 step back metaphor is probably very accurate.
Javier, I'd like to direct the question to you, and kind of in light of the perhaps disheartening report that Hunter just shared with us about the state in Chile. Chile, of course, was a country that the Human Rights Campaign listed at the beginning of this year as one of 5 countries in the world to watch for marriage equality. And obviously these obstacles have been disheartening for many in this movement. But what other countries do you think are on the precipice? And again, Javier, zooming out, how would you assess the current state of the LGBT rights movement in the Americas?
I think it's important that we recognize that we're not in a situation where we're making the progress that we were making even 3 years ago. I think we are now facing what I've called a backlash, a political backlash. The forces against progress on this issue are far more organized politically than we ever imagined. And so all governments, left or right, are feeling this pressure. And it's a little bit worrisome. That doesn't mean that the work that folks like Margarita and Gabriela and Iván and Hunter are doing is hopeless. It's just that right now there is a counterwave. And so I wouldn't say that we're very close to seeing another Costa Rica or necessarily seeing Chile change from where it is now. And so it is time to, in many ways, regroup and see what is going to be required for the next stage of the battles.
Margarita, Javier just mentioned, obviously, Costa Rica, a country that you've done so much work in. And in May of this year, Costa Rica became the first country in Central America to legalize same-sex marriage. And so I was hoping you could maybe share with us the work that was done in the years leading up to that victory. And perhaps how replicable that sort of multifaceted strategy that you in many ways led might be elsewhere. Because as we know, Costa Rica's neighbors have not seen as much success, whether it's in Guatemala, where a bill in Congress sought to keep same-sex marriage illegal, or in Panama, where in October of 2019, legislators proposed a constitutional amendment that sought to define marriage as between a man and a woman. How optimistic are you, given the work that you've done and kind of your sense of where this movement is, that these countries in Central America and elsewhere might follow Costa Rica's example?
Well, thank you everyone for joining in. I think it's pretty clear that the advances in LGBT rights will likely happen by the hand of the court rather by the hand of Congress. Because of the nature of national assemblies and congresses, it's very easy to block this kind of advances. Costa Rica started in putting forward recourses to our constitutional court, and they kept getting rejected. In 2013, we launched a signature campaign to put forward a project by popular initiative. If you collect a percentage of the votes, of the signatures of the people who would vote, that in our case was about 175,000 signatures, you can put forward a bill without having a congressman or woman sign it. We started the collection process. We would stop people in parks, in shopping malls, and everywhere to get them to sign a signature. And of course, not everybody agreed. A lot of people would just reject it. I think we, in about a year and a half, we managed to collect about 50,000 signatures. We must have spoken to nearly 200,000 people, just talking about the issue and placing it on the agenda. And that started to shift a little bit the needle. But I think it was key, the consultation the country does to the Inter-American Human Rights Court. And in that sense, I'd like to point to the importance of having political figures that are willing to step up their game and put their careers on the line, because really this puts people's careers on the line. This is a risk for a government to make a statement, because then it gets us, that party gets associated with the issue, and that's not necessarily positive. People are very afraid of this. But I do have a message for the region, which is people tend to be afraid that this means that they will be voted out of office. And in the case of Costa Rica, it was quite the contrary. They were voted in office because of this issue. So I think part of the thing is that people's perceptions are starting to change, and this becomes an issue in the political voting arena. So it's important to understand that this is an issue and that population's acceptance of this is growing. So building that political environment is very important for when that comes in. We also took a second step, which was a campaign called Si Acepto, that was focused not on legal issues, not on rights, which is the language we usually talk in, but more on the human aspects of it. Why? Because some of the polls started to reveal that people did not understand why LGBT people want to get married. When they were asked, why do gay people get married? Their answer was, we don't know. It's probably because they want, to advance their agenda or something. And none of the answers around love, family, commitment started coming up. So we shifted completely to a narrative that focused on families and on people and kind of saying, also because some people perceive this as an elite issue. Oh, it's the people with money that want to get married. It's the elite folks. So we started showcasing working class families that would talk about why they supported their son, fishermen, farmers, people from all over the country kind of talking in a very simple language and admitting that they had had issues first with accepting their relative and that eventually they had realized that family is family. So I think that there we have some keys of how maybe the issue could advance in some of the parts. There's a work that has to do with creating a political environment that makes the issue more handleable for the population.
I find that fascinating because I think if you look at polls, the part that you just mentioned about how you phrase the question is particularly interesting, because I think if you look at polls in the region, when they broadly ask how tolerant are you of LGBT people, despite impressive legal advances in the region, there continues to be some startling homophobic and transphobic conditions manifested in response to that sort of question. But when you reframe it as a familiar one, as one based on family, everything kind of changes. And so I'd like to turn it now to Iván and see if you have seen the same sorts of developments in Panama. Have you seen the same sort of perhaps courageous political movements and even courageous political leaders willing to stake their reputation on this question and really willing to perhaps transform public opinion on these issues?
Well, thank you, Guy, for the invitation on Global Americans, and I'm thrilled to be next to this amazing panel. Yes, I have seen it, but in a very early stage. I guess I will agree in mostly what have said, and I like how Hunter compare what's happening in Chile with Panama, and I will add to countries like El Salvador and maybe Peru. Gabriela will tell if I'm right or wrong. These countries that now we are not getting the answers that the courts should have gave us in the past. Panama is waiting for marriage cases since 2016 with any decision from the court. We have 3 cases already in the Supreme Court. So it's time to maybe reformulate the strategy, and I agree it should have come by the courts, but because of what Javier also said, and you, Guy, in your introduction, now the countries who were left behind in this social change, of course, are the ones, including Panama, who are more attacked by conservative groups and organized conservative groups. And it's a correlation with some evangelical churches. So it is broader than a national problem. It's a regional problem that countries like Panama are facing. I was going to just make my opinion, but also Margarita introduced brilliantly good cases like Si Acepto in Costa Rica, which is a lot of what happened also in the US with the social change that were next to or paired to the legal change. And this is where organizations like Fundación Iguales in Panama, and we work with Margarita and work with Gabriela with the same mindset that, yes, we need to hit the courts and ask them to do the right thing. Like, for example, if Panama doesn't grant marriage equality, it will be the first court in this side of the world that will deny marriage equality. Like, is this the country that is perceived, you guys are perceiving with the canal, with the hub, with the interconnectivity? Is that a country of the region? I don't think it is. if they left behind the LGBTI community. And to specifically to the political representation, I introduced my conversation saying that I seen it initially, and we're trying to ignite, to inspire people that it is time to first elect people who believe in human rights. And secondly, run for office. I had the privilege to work for the first now elected congressman, a person in Congress who supported in the history of the country marriage equality and trans rights, and in general support for the LGBTI community. He is young, he's in his, well, recently 30. He was late 20s when I worked for him for his campaign, and we got elected. He was the second most voted independent candidate in the history of the country. And he had a platform who was, you know, very focused on specifics. He's an expert in anti-corruption, and he's a constitutionalist professor. But he came from, you know, studying in the US, studying in the UK, with this fresh new message of a different kind of politics. And that was paid in the election day. So I have seen it by my experience that we also need to change that political and representation and participation to hopefully advance not only in the courts and in the social programs that NGOs and campaigns like CSEPTO are doing around the region. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Iván. Gabriela, I'd like to turn to you now. We're talking about kind of building the political will on the ground. And as I mentioned in my introduction, you rose to prominence in the LGBT movement during the Unión Civil Ya campaign in Peru. And so I'm hoping that you could tell us a little bit more about the grassroots energy and the civil rights activism on the ground in Peru. And also I know that you've done a lot of work now on mental health and the impact that these conditions have on LGBT individuals. And I'm hoping that you can share with our audience and with our panel the results of that work.
Yes, thank you, Guy. Thank you for the invitation. I'm so glad to be here with these amazing panelists. Well, in Peru, for the last, let's say, 7 to 8 years, we've had a very vibrant and alive LGBTI movement, because there's this thing in Peru where legal changes or legal initiatives are the ones that trigger the movement and the social, let's say, uprising. So in 2013, there was the civil unions bill. So there formed a coalition of organizations and activists and everyone that was interested in guaranteeing civil unions and family rights for same-sex couples. This campaign lasted around 2 years. Eventually, the bill was rejected. It didn't pass. But the thing that we got from the campaign was that the awakening of the movement, because the population, the LGBTI community, and our allies, they understood that we needed to speak up, we needed to organize, and we needed to get involved in political advocacy. So that's what we did. We first organized massive mobilizations. So we got thousands of people out on the streets asking for same-sex couples' rights. And we did that 3 times, and it even helped the Pride March. Usually the Pride March in Peru were like a little low. People still like they didn't know if they wanted to go because they were scared or afraid of perception or getting mixed with other people. But since these marches, the marches that we did for civil unions, the Pride marches became bigger and bigger, and every year they're bigger than the one before. So that's what I call an awakening of our community into getting out on the streets and making their voices heard. Then after the civil unions bill, now we have in Congress marriage equality bill and gender identity recognition bill. They are well joined with the hate crime bill. These are the three main legal initiatives that we are working to have approved and passed by the Congress. Unfortunately, it's been a constant that the Congress in Peru is very, very conservative. So that's what I agree with Iván. We need to elect LGBTI-friendly, LGBTI congressmen and congresswomen, and not only for Congress. We also need them in regional government, in local government, in the municipalities. We need them everywhere, and we need ourselves there too. Because here in Peru we have three main issues. There's the discrimination, violence, and hate crimes, which are already we have been seeing an increase in reports in these cases and investigation. We just had a ruling from the Inter-American Court on the case of Azul Rojas Marin versus Peru, which is a transgender woman that was assaulted by police agents, and the case went to the Inter-American Human Rights Commission in court, and she won, because now the state is responsible for what happened to her, and now the state has to take some measures, very important measures, to ensure that this doesn't happen again. Also, there's the issue of gender identity recognition, which the transgender community here in Peru has been doing an incredible job, and even now during the pandemic, because the transgender community in Peru is the most vulnerable of all, and because because of the lack of access to education, to work, to public health, to housing, to basically every basic right, and marriage equality. There's absolutely no protection for LGBTI families, for same-sex couples in Peru. There's absolutely no way, and maybe around drafting a contract or anything, that you can provide protection to your family or to your couple, to your partner. That's worsened by this health emergency, because if your partner dies right now, you are left alone, and anyone from the other family can come and take away everything that you built. And the interesting case is that lots of couples are getting married abroad, in Argentina, in the United States, in Spain, in Mexico, and they're trying to get their marriages recognized here in Peru, but still they're fighting for this right. So we are waiting for the Constitutional Court to make a ruling on it. And on the mental health side, we did a study on mental health practices and perceptions for LGBTIQ people. We found that a lot of mental health practitioners have prejudices and discriminate against LGBTIQ people when they treat them, and this causes lots of symptoms of anxiety, of depression, of even suicidal ideation, and this opens the door to the conversion therapies. We discovered that this is still a practice that is still going on in Peru. It's still like going under the radar of the government. So we are working with the United Nations, and we are working with the local governments to try to get at least these centers that provide these therapies like shut down, and make this subject more known, so that the people and the mental and the health authorities can take a stance and once for all like stop it, prohibit the conversion therapies in Peru.
Thank you so much, Gabriela. Hunter, I'd like to turn it back to you as our resident legal expert on this panel. It seems that what we're dancing around in this first round of questions is an important paradox, that despite impressive legal advances over the last many years, there is a lack of political will and conditions on the ground, as Gabriela mentioned, have shown a surge of some startling homophobic and transphobic conditions. And so as you all know, the landmark 2017 opinion of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights stated that all rights applicable to heterosexual couples should extend to same-sex couples. And again, as you all know, and as many in our audience may know, rulings of the IACHR apply to the 25 countries that have ratified the 1969 American Convention on Human Rights. But the countries must change their own domestic legislation because the court doesn't have the power to revise it on its own. And so what do you attribute the resistance we have seen in the region since 2017? And what can be done legally and on a grassroots level to expedite implementation of IACHR opinions and recommendations? And I guess one last question I have for you is, what does it say, generally speaking, about the strength of the Inter-American human rights system if states don't expeditiously implement its recommendations and its decisions?
Well, I'll start at the end, actually, because Iván, who I would also consider to be the legal scholar on this panel, Iván and I appeared before the Inter-American Commission leading a panel of representatives from different countries in what they call a thematic hearing on the subject of marriage equality, but it was really the subject of the state of LGBT rights and health. And we told them in December of 2019, that trans people are being beaten on the streets, and trans women are being raped and are being forced into terrible living situations, out of healthcare, into terrible mental health problems, as Gabriela said. And so, the reason we want to debate the issue of marriage equality and have it brought to the fore is that it is the way of eliminating stigma. And so we felt that was important. We're waiting for the commission to act. That's why we're going back to the commission. Now, let me say this about the Inter-American human rights system. It's actually rather strong. I have to say, when we first entered it in 2012, for Chile, I was quite pessimistic. Cases were not coming forward very fast, and compliance with them was not happening very quickly. The current leadership of the Inter-American Commission has done a tremendous job. President Margaret May Macaulay, Executive Secretary Paulo Abreu, commissioners like Flavio Piovesan from Brazil, Esmeralda Troitinho from Panama, have really gotten to work. They've cleared out a backlog. They're energetic in their defense of human rights, and they've handed down some courageous and important decisions and are taking cases. I have every confidence, for those reasons, that when our case resumes its place in line, the case against Chile, as we were informed last week that we shall, that the decision on admissibility of our petition will be handled quickly, and that we will get to the merits, and that we'll get back in front of the Inter-American Court. So I think that the thrust of those observations is that especially for the political scientists in the room, is that the system created somewhat optimistically to provide a floor beneath which no South American country or Central American country member of the system could go in terms of violating of human rights, is remarkably robust and effective. And it's different than the European Tribunal of Human Rights. The European Tribunal, as we're seeing in all the marriage equality cases, is often cited for having something called a margin of appreciation. That's a rule that they follow where they don't go on to new ground until there's a consensus among member states. We have the irony in the Americas that 80% of the population, in round numbers, 80% of the population in all the Americas now lives where their same-sex couple friends can get married and have their legal marriages recognized. That's an amazing fact. The Americas are in the vanguard, if you look at it from that perspective. But flip it around, and how many of the governments, how many of the states are providing that protection? And it's only about 25%, which means that about 3/4 of the states in the region, the islands of the Caribbean, the Central American countries, have really got to get their act together, right? And that's the holdback. So the progress we also see beyond the state legal structure is progress that we see in organizations. There are multinational organizations that are very busy and involved and active in opposing marriage equality. American and Brazilian evangelical churches are found in Panama and Colombia and Costa Rica and Ecuador, all fighting marriage equality. But God forbid the New York City Bar should send an amicus brief to the Panama Supreme Court and explain how marriage equality was arrived at in the United States, a very anodyne brief that just presents evidence and arguments. And of course, they immediately get denounced for internationalizing or imposing sort of marriage equality. The fact is that there are incipient, but I think very strong efforts to organize the marriage equality movement, the LGBT leaders, LGBT lawyers, LGBT social activists, but we've got a long way to go. We need to do institution building, we need to do technical capacity building, you know, and training, and we need resources. Now, in the last year, for the first time, I've been able to see more progress in those forces coming together to try to learn how they can help each other. And it will help as they do. But I must say the most important and powerful thing are these truly authentic movements. Si Accepto, for example, is beautiful. It's absolutely powerful. It's a great play on words, right? I accept my neighbor, but yes, that's the way you say I do in a wedding ceremony. And they did what we did in New York in 2009 and 2010 when we were trying to get marriage equality passed. We realized that we had to convince our neighbors. We had to tell them what it was. And so, you know, my sense is that the terms of the political structures, like the strength of the inter-American human rights system, are capable of bringing this progress forward. They just have to be pushed to do so. And it takes a mix, not just lawyers, not this legalized approach only, but these sort of civil society organizations, you know, maybe even primarily. As far as resistance, as far as the backsliding, you know, we saw that play happened here. The two factors, though, that I see over and over again in all the work I've done on marriage equality and on LGBT rights is that you do see backsliding, you do see people trying to slide it back. But the two most important factors to me are, number one, does a legislator or a judge or a political leader have a family member who's gay or lesbian? The more that someone comes out and that their niece or their uncle is gay or lesbian affects decision makers and for the better. And there are lots of good reasons we can discuss one day about that involving cognitive dissonance, that family and friend matters more than abstract idea if they can find a way to square those two things. But the other factor is being on the right side of history. And it's by now clear, because of the statistics I was just quoting, which way this is really going. So those who oppose marriage equality really are increasingly minoritarian forces.
I would, Javier, I'm going to turn this to you, and it's a loaded question, picking up on some of the things that Hunter just mentioned about why those minority forces may be as powerful and influential as they are. And so when we look at the region, after years of hard-fought progress for LGBT rights in Latin America, we've seen, particularly in the latter half of the last decade, a particularly strong new form of backlash. Though just a few years ago, one might look at the region and see some of the most progressive legislation and government policies toward LGBT groups in Latin America, we've also, since 2015 in particular, seen a number of organized homophobic and transphobic marches sweeping Brazil, Chile, Colombia, the Dominican Republic, Mexico, and Peru. And so I don't know that it's possible, and again, Hunter mentioned this in his last answer, I don't know that it's really possible to discuss the state of the LGBT movement in the Americas today without noting that those state-led homophobia persists. In Brazil, for instance, you see it with Jair Bolsonaro representing arguably the most openly homophobic politician in Latin America in many years. But arguably the strongest backlash has come from non-state actors. And again, Hunter mentioned this with the rise of evangelical groups, which have emerged as powerful veto players in the region. And so in recent years, you might say that the rising power of evangelical groups in conjunction with right-wing populism has led to not only new organizations, not only new arguments, not only new resources, but also new alliances that are challenging new and existing progress. And so you've written extensively about this, Javier, about backlashes against LGBT rights expansion in Latin America. And I'm curious what you make of this new form of backlash, to the extent that you agree it would qualify as such, and what makes it different? What sort of alliances, perhaps both domestic and international, do you see forming with traditional political actors, including the Catholic Church? And what obstacles does that pose for NGOs fighting for marriage equality and other critical rights?
Can you hear me now?
We can,
yes.
we can.
Great. So there is no question that from societal actors, the most important barrier comes from religious groups. And this includes what we can call conservative Catholics, which in the laity is diminishing, but conservative evangelicals, which demographically are increasing very fast. And they're coming together in a way that we didn't see before. Catholics and evangelicals used to be competitors, but in the past few years, they have begun to cooperate. They are cooperating because for them, they don't see each other as threats anymore. They see secularism and the rise of what they call ideology of gender as their new enemy. So they're coming together, and this is one reason why it's a strong force, that it's evangelicals, but also with support from the Catholic Church. Having said that, the evangelical groups don't really need this partner that much, although it helps the conservative Catholics. Evangelicals have what I have described as the most remarkable political advantage as an NGO, as a non-governmental organization. I don't think in Latin America there is any other organization that can compete with evangelicals in terms of their grassrootedness. These groups do a lot of very important work, social work, that allows them to establish very profound ties with their members. And the result of this is that their members become ardent defenders of these churches. But the problem is that when you ask these evangelicals their views on issues of sexuality and gender identity and anything having to do with women-men relationships, they're very conservative and they are very uncritical. Even if they have high levels of education or income, which are variables that we associate with more open attitudes, evangelicals remain very much aligned with what their pastors are saying. They're very connected. And politicians who are not necessarily evangelicals know that they need to court these groups because they bring out the vote. This is a type of NGO that can mobilize votes in ways that very few other groups can do. So you see, even in the United States with Trump courting the evangelical sector in an explicit political alliance. And this model is now being imitated. We saw it, we're seeing it in Brazil, we're even seeing it in Mexico. So it is worrisome. Having said that, let me just give the good news here. A significant folks who are Catholics are what I would call light Catholics. They are very much queer allies. And of course, non-religious folks as well. So the battleground is not finished. There are parts of the Latin American electorate that is very amenable to a new campaign on behalf of LGBT rights.
Great, thank you so much, Javier. I am going to turn this now to Margarita. We have an audience question that is relevant to this point. And the audience member asks, or states rather, it seems that part of the backsliding on LGBTQ rights is part of a broader anti-rights agenda coming from well-coordinated conservative activists. This agenda is discriminatory against women and other minority groups. Given that the LGBTQ community is demographically broad, would it make sense to try to build an even broader cross-sectional and multi-sectoral movement that addresses the anti-democratic, anti-rights threat in Latin America?
Yes, of course. And here's where I welcome LGBT folks to the feminist movement. One of the issues that we need to do is come together in our forces. We are seeing in the US at this moment a very strong anti-racist uprising. And that's great, because for years, this has been an issue that has also affected the LGBT community. And here's where it's interesting to look at things from an angle of class also. The challenges faced by LGBT folks are different according to the class that we belong to, because money also comes into play, access to resources also comes into play. And yes, for these groups, women's rights are just as much a threat as LGBT rights, because it all has to do with a cultural war on what they consider to be a natural order. I think that this whole thing places the issue of gender and of gender roles at the center of the political debate. And it's interesting because for years we have been told by political groups, by political party groups, this is a fringe debate, this is not important. Well, how important do you consider it now that it's defining your presidential election, you know? So I think that it's important for us to start doing this work. And here's a call out specifically to political parties to do work with their grassroots, with their bases on gender. Because if you don't, eventually you're caught in a problem where you have bases that don't really share your progressive stances. I think that courts and congresses are great thermometers in the sense that as popular opinion shifts one way or another, so do they. When we started placing the first legal recourses, they used to get rejected. Years later, the same court would approve the recourses we had brought forward below. Why? Because the political arena had changed. Nothing had changed legally. It was just a matter of public perception. So I definitely think that it's very important to work with people. What Javier was saying is very important. Evangelical groups are close to their grassroots. And here's a huge mea culpa. Here's a huge fault we have been in. A lot of the progressive LGBT movements are very capital center, very centralized in big populations. And then we leave out a lot of the rural area folks, and they feel very abandoned, and we don't mean anything to them. So when you have to make a decision between supporting the folks that bring you food, that bring you shelter, that visit you 3 times a week, or supporting the folks that you have never seen in your life, well, the choice is very clear. So I think there's also an issue here. The greater equality our countries have, the more our countries are able to provide for the needs and realities of people in all sorts of parts of the country. The less we leave people behind, the more likely it is we are to have those people be able to support the needs and realities. In Costa Rica, part of the debate was kind of thinking, you only tend to LGBT people. You don't care about the poor. You don't care about the needed. And we have to break that polarity. We can't allow them to set this as an issue of belief versus non-belief. We have to get voices from the believers speaking strongly for LGBT rights, from the evangelical sector, from the Catholic sector, and we can't allow them either to polarize this debate between those who have and those who don't have. We have to also make them aware that there are poor LGBT people, that we are part of the poor as well. So that we need to like break this binaries, if you will, so that the debate doesn't become polarized in that sense.
Iván, I'd like to direct this question to you now, and making note and taking stock of where we are with respect to coronavirus and how that might impact this conversation as well. I think time and again, when you ask experts in this space, and we've emphasized it today, that in this moment, trans people are struggling arguably the most. And there have been a number of studies in recent weeks showing that LGBTQ people are disproportionately impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, with transgender people and transgender people of color in particular, more likely to become unemployed due to the virus, more likely to have their work hours reduced, more likely to have asked for delays in paying their rent or paying their bills. And I know in Panama in particular, President Cortizo put into effect a gender-based quarantine schedule in response to COVID-19. which would require effectively men and women to remain quarantined on alternate days. And so as a result, transgender people were singled out for profiling by police and by private security guards, and in some cases were arrested and fined or prevented from buying essential goods like groceries. And so I was hoping you could speak a little bit to that development, to the pushback to those presidential guidelines, and generally speaking, perhaps, how much more vulnerable has COVID-19 made the LGBTQ community?
Sure. Well, it's a very dramatic situation, and it's been implemented almost since the beginning of the restrictions related to the pandemic. It is important also to clarify that this is a measure established by the Ministry of Health, which right now have like all the powers you could imagine in a constitutional democracy like Panama. So it's Cortiz's administration, but it is the Ministry of Health who decides on these specific issues, just to clarify that. As you described, this is a measure that Panama, I think, is the only country in the world who still have this. Colombia and Peru have, well, Bogota, Cartagena, and Peru have briefly this measure that it is clear, it is logical that it's not a good measure. So how and why a country decides to have such a binary view of the world? Well, it's the lack of human rights perspective in their political policies, in the public policies at the end of the world, at the end of the day, which is a common problem, not only during the pandemic. This is what's before. It's always has been like this. We don't exist for the government. We are not visible for the government. Therefore, the political policies does not include everyone who's different. And this is very related to the conversation about cross-sectional issues. Of course, this is affecting a specific population, which is trans and non-binary persons, but also women, but also people with disabilities, with also to older persons. In the case of trans people, we have been documenting the number of discrimination towards trans people who are have been deterred to enter to supermarkets to buy food, which is outrageous. It's the most basic right to get food and medicine. It's been deterred or restrained to a number of people in the country. We had so many, had sent so many communications to the government. We have even talked to the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, the High Commission of Human Rights. They have all said that this measure should be changed immediately. And the government has waiting, 90 something days and still doesn't take the step to amend this. But I wanna pivot to an interesting experience that the organization had, because we pair with Hombres Trans, which is a trans men organization with Fundación Iguales, and we start giving humanitarian systems to any trans person who said that they needed either money or food because they couldn't leave their houses to go to a supermarket because of discrimination that you introduced and I just said. And the support of the population and the support of even people who were not so pro LGBTI rights changed. And I guess it was like a slap in the face that this type of discrimination, the violence, because imagine being a trans person that you cannot leave your house to buy milk and bread. This is awful. So that was like slapping the face of many people who were like, no, you are right. You just want marriage or gender identity laws because you want to just advance on your agenda, examples that you currently hear. Oh, you're just upper class and you want to get married. No. This is about the stigma and discrimination and the violence that we still face in our communities. I don't know if somebody said already, but the life expectancy of a trans woman in Latin America is between 30 and 35 years old. This is awful. And this is part of a systematic, problem of discrimination, which also can be extended to other groups. And I'm gonna just respond to the idea before. And yes, I agree that we as LGBTI organizations and movement need to expand, regroup, like Javier said that word before, with other organizations. We work with feminist organizations, we work with Afro-descendants organizations, and we always include the view in any panel, any academic event that we have, voices of other minority groups. I guess it's easy from a broader perspective, and when you are an international organization, to just ask that, you know, in a whim. You all should work together. And I get it, and we get it, but it's hard. And I'll tell you why. Because our organizations are not funded in our countries, doesn't have support of the government. We need to build up our capacities to then enhance and coordinate and regroup with our organizations. So I just wanna respond with a yes, but also with a, you know, it is easy to ask that when you're not in the ground and you face, you know, so many, you know, in your own agenda, you have so many problems to fix. Easy to ask to, you know, to have a perfect coordinated, we need help and we're gonna do it, but it's part of the problem, you know, reinforce how civil society in the region is working, and we need the support and create alliances. And we have been doing it. Like one is the coalition of LGBTI lawyers who are now coordinating how to, yes, my problem in Panama, if it's not solved, is the problem of people in Colombia. We know they are aligned, so we need to have a more aligned strategy. Thank you.
Thank you. Gabriela, can I turn it to you as well and see, with your work with Más Igualdad Perú, what sort of alliances you've formed, what the situation is on the ground in terms of the rights and the protections afforded to trans individuals. And I know here in the United States, for instance, the US Supreme Court recently ruled that in the 1964 Civil Rights Act protects members of the LGBT community from discrimination based on sex in the workplace. Countries like Chile and Costa Rica have passed laws similarly protecting LGBT people from discrimination in the workplace, but Peru does not. And so wondering if you could touch upon that as well in terms of workplace discrimination and the regional alliances that you have formed and the national alliances that you have formed to protect members of the LGBT movement.
Yes. Well, right now in Peru, the only legislation that we could consider as a protection for LGBTIQ community is the it's called a legislative decree. We call it Decreto Legislativo. It's 1323, and it includes specifically sexual orientation and gender identity as categories protected from discrimination. And that's basically what we have, and not anything else. Let's say we don't have anything in place for workplace discrimination, or mainly what we could think about is protections included in the National Human Rights Plan, but it's also this like disaggregated, it's all unconnected, you know. So basically when we talk about workplace discrimination or how we can overcome it, it mostly relates to specific actions that the companies or the businesses can put in place to ensure recognition of name, of preferred gender, ensure protections for families and for same-sex couples. So we knew about this case from one gay man from Brazil who came from Brazil to Peru. He had a civil union there, and here in Peru he doesn't have it. So his company had to help him like put in place a new health insurance, new protections, so that it started like a procedure in that company. So that impacts also the transgender community, because it prevents them from accessing work, from accessing formal employment. Right now, there's a big percentage of the transgender population, especially women, who right now are not working, because before the pandemic they work in like informal jobs, not within the formal structure of employment, but working independently or working in sexual work. So now that we have social isolation and distancing, there's no businesses open, there's no restaurants, there's no bakeries, there's like restaurants and hairstylists where they work too. So they are very they suffer really the impact of the pandemic. So that's why in Más Igualdad we have the idea to align with two organizations. They are called Féminas, which is from transgender women, and Diversidades Transmasculinas, which is for transgender men and transmasculine people, so that we could receive donations from individuals to give them economic support. So we got a list. We received lists of people that were in need of help and who didn't qualify for the bonifications that the government was sending. Basically, none of the LGBTIQ people is qualifying for it. So we started to channel donations and giving to the transgender people in vulnerability. So we are privileged, we are lucky to be able to form these kinds of alliances to help in the ways that we can. Also, this year, like in June, we submitted a shadow report to the Human Rights Committee of the United Nations. It was specifically about LGBTQ issues in Peru, and we did it as a coalition with 3 transgender organizations: Féminas, Diversidades Transmasculinas, and Fraternidad Transmasculina, which is in Arequipa, which is another region of Peru. They have another kind of perspective and activities, and we could put together a really strong report, and we sent it, and we have been receiving very great feedback from all the things that we could put in the report. So it's really important to get to know the activists, get to know between each other. We know that we can have difference. Maybe our kind of activism or our kind of strategies is different from the others, and it also reflects a lot the experiences, the knowledge, and also the vulnerability and the danger that they are in. So we have to find points in common to get alliances, to get coalitions, because perhaps you may think that we are more interested in marriage equality, but our main interest really is preventing discrimination, preventing violence, and preventing any kind of hatred and violence to all the LGBTIQ community.
Great. As we near the end of our time together, Hunter, I'd like to turn this to you for a more forward-looking, perhaps hopeful vision for the future. I know you've put us aptly on kind of the historical perspective of where we are, where we've been, and where we're going. I'd love it if you could share with our audience where you see the movement going, where you see progress in the years ahead, and perhaps if we have reason to be hopeful, what is that reason?
I guess I get to be the optimist on the panel, even though I'm the one complaining to the Inter-American human rights system. I'll start by taking the negative of that question. Judge Karen Atala, a lesbian, lost her custody of her children in Peru, in Chile, in the early 2000s, simply because she loved another woman. And Chile lost that case. It took forever to get to the Inter-American Court. And Chile's never fully complied with the order of the court in that case. So I'm optimistic because of the people that are in the Inter-American system and because of the power. I was reading yesterday that one of the judges of the Inter-American Court, speaking on Pride Sunday yesterday, acknowledged her sense that as she was participating in the decision, the OC-24 decision, that granted trans people the right to their own integrity and dignity, and to same-sex couples equal treatment under the law. She knew she was making a groundbreaking decision, and she was participating in something encouraging and inspiring. When I started in law school, I met Michael Hardwick of the famous Supreme Court case Bowers versus Hardwick. It was handed down in 1986. That'll tell you how old I am. I was in law school at the time. And I learned about the case, from how it happened and how it affected him, and what a sad and strange time and difficult time that was. We had the AIDS epidemic in the 90s in the LGBT community. What a dark, dark moment that is. If we think this pandemic is dark, at least everyone in the world is pulling together to do something about it, or try to. Back then, you had exactly the opposite. So to sum up some of the themes that we've heard today, I find optimism because we have allies, because people are jumping in to participate, because people want to be on the right side of history, because people know someone who's gay or lesbian. You know, if the LGBT community is maybe 3% of the population, who knows, estimates widely vary. What we are learning, and Margarita made this point beautifully, is that we're not who you think we are. After marriage equality became the law in the United States, we found out from marital statistics who was marrying. And it turns out they're people in small towns, 2 women who have a couple of kids who fostered those kids and now can adopt them in a small rural town in Kentucky who wanted to get married. There are many examples of that. So the truth is coming out. People are using the internet and social media to expose themselves to other people and to learn new ideas. Young people are growing up without that sense of despair. All the bigger organic forces are on our side, I think. But there are very strong organized forces against that. And, you know, if you live in Brazil or if you live in the United States today, you may really wonder, is your country backsliding into a kind of nationalistic, authoritarian, anti-democratic posture? Is that possible? Well, we wonder that too in the LGBT world. Is it possible that even though a court ruling will favor us, that it won't be enforced? Even though a country like Chile adopts a hate crimes law, that the court doesn't really stand behind it? Or that anti-discrimination laws exist in a handful of countries? And like so many other positive things in the region, unfortunately, it's a law that's a paper tiger. So I think that the best thing I can say that I've heard, and I've seen it exemplified by the panelists I've been listening to here today, is that they're smart, they're getting connected, they're innovative, they're doing a lot with a little. But big organizations like the leading LGBT groups in the United States, for example, that help secure rights here, we really need you to remember that you're part of a global situation. Our rights here in America are no more safe than they are anywhere else in the rest of the world unless we work together. And I've been calling for that greater increased participation, and I'm beginning to see it even more. Iván and I worked on something in the last couple of years, which I won't go into, that exemplifies that, where a major marriage equality leader in the United States, Evan Wolfson, founder of Freedom to Marry, has helped his organization to expand and to provide the most extraordinarily valuable resources to help people identify messaging and to sharpen their messaging and to serve, as I do as a pro bono lawyer, as an invited friend, an invited guest to help out. We need more of that. But because I think it's there, I'm optimistic.
Well, we've gone about 10 minutes over the time that we asked people to reserve for this event. So I'd like to close now and not abuse the time of our panelists today. I'd like to thank everyone who joined us today, panelists and audience alike. This is one of many webinars that Global Americans will be rolling out in the coming weeks. And so please look to our website, theglobalamericains.org, for more information. And if you enjoyed the conversation today, we would encourage you to sign up for our weekly newsletter, which provides a concise summary of developments in the region once a week, every Friday, so we won't bombard your inbox. It has been an extraordinary honor to share the virtual stage with this distinguished panel and to bask in all of the work that they're doing across the hemisphere. To all listening, happy Pride, and thank you on behalf of Global Americans. Until next time.